All right, we are now going into questions for 1396. And first up, we have Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, these are questions just on 1396.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask, Charlotte Brantly is still here, correct? Thank you. And maybe Jeff also. Do we know if the forced shutdown of golf for the 2019 season will trigger the right of Clayton to terminate the agency agreement? The way I've read it is similar to the way Woody Garnsey read it, which is that if golf cannot be conducted, and I know the intention is to restore it at some point, I guess for the 2020 season perhaps, but if it's not played for that season, hi John, you're also going to backstop this. Would that trigger, Charlotte, would that trigger Clayton's right to terminate the agency agreement in your view?
So, Councilman, if I may, I also have my attorney here tonight,
Yes. Hi,
Bruce James, and I would really prefer that he answer that question, if that's all right with you.
Uh-oh, okay. That means we're really in trouble.
Good evening, Bruce James, attorney for Clayton Trust. I think Brad Cameron really said it correctly, which is it defers the question. It is a factual question whether or not, following the condemnation, the course can be restored to an 18-hole regulation golf course and driving range. The city staff today believes it can be. Right. Clayton has neither agreed nor disagreed with that assessment, in part because what we recognize is if Arcis, the operator, renews its lease, Clayton's perfectly happy. This whole process started was because Clayton was concerned about losing its income at the end of the lease in 2019. And if, in fact, Arcis doesn't renew the lease, we will have a future community discussion around the future of the golf course, much like Clayton has already initiated in cooperation with the city. So it defers the question to a later day. And of course, if ultimately there was a decision by the community, with many of these same people in the room, to move forward, this council, again, would have the chance to look at it. So the council is not waiving any rights tonight if it proceeds with 96, nor is Clayton, but we will defer it to a future community conversation if the golf course operator does not renew the lease.
Thank you. And that lease that option is for 5 years, correct?
They have 2 5-year options.
2 5-year options.
And it was correct. It stated they have till July 1 to decide whether or not to renew.
Right. And one more question, Mr. President, on 96, and that is, remind me, and I guess any one of you up there might know the answer, how will the Clayton Trust replace the income from Arcis, from the golf concessionaire for the 2019 season? The golf concessionaire certainly isn't obligated to make payments if it's not permitted to conduct golf.
No, that would be part of the compensation would be paid as part of either
the easement.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. The easement and part of the relocation, which is the restoration. During the restoration, they would be compensated for loss of income.
Great. All right, thank you. That's all, Mr. President, on this one.
All right, thank you, Councilman Flynn. Councilwoman Kniech.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sitting next to Councilman Flynn has clearly had an impact on the two of us. So I want to follow up on his same question. I'm going to ask it a little more narrowly, Bruce or Charlotte, which is not so much deferring the question of can the golf course be replaced, but the fear that's being communicated by the public is that even a temporary disruption in golf, you all could or might pursue action then. And so I'm asking if today you can clearly state that you would not proceed with any action triggering that clause of the contract about condemnation based on a temporary loss of golf access. And I think this is less of a legal question and more of where is Clayton at morally. You've come forward today in support of this ordinance. You've taken a position and you've said this ordinance should pass. I would consider it incredible bad faith if you then said, oh, and by the way, now that you've passed it, I'm going to use this temporary disruption to trigger this clause. I mean, that would be extraordinary. So I think you've probably contemplated this question already. So I'm asking you just about your intentions with regard to temporary disruption of the golf course. If you can please answer on that point.
I'm going to start until he pulls my coat and says, wait. So you've asked a really interesting question, and particularly when you talk about morally and sort of where are we and what are we thinking. I guess the best answer I can give you to that at the moment is that we as the trustees of the trust are legally bound to ensure that we are leveraging the assets of that trust on behalf of the beneficiaries of Mr. Clayton's trust. What he envisioned was that his assets upon his death would be used to ensure that vulnerable children in Denver, primarily was what he was thinking at that time, that vulnerable children would be given a great start in life and would become, his will even speaks to becoming, wonderful citizens based on the services that they were given. And so when you talk about where are we sort of morally speaking on this, I have to say that's where we are as the Clayton Trust and as the operator of the programming that we do. You know, what happens down the road here, we are intending to be a partner with the city in this transaction. That's been clear for a long time. We have been talking for, I would say, 6 years now, maybe, about the fact that stormwater naturally flows to that northeast corner. We've been talking about some way of using that as a way to mitigate storm water damage, flooding. So our position is that we intend to be a partner with the city in this transaction, and that's why we're here to support this ordinance.
I'm going to ask, you may want to confer with Mr. James, and I'll ask a different question, but you didn't really answer my question. So, and this is really important, my vote may depend on it. You have come forward supporting this ordinance. Would you possibly use this ordinance to trigger the condemnation clause? That you're supporting this ordinance, would you use that clause based on this ordinance, based on temporary disruption of golf? And if you know the answer to that question, and again, if you guys want to confer, that's fair, but it's a really important question.
Councilwoman, if I understand the question, to make sure I get it correctly, because I know how important it is to you, is if the question is solely whether the temporary taking, the answer is I do not believe under the temporary taking that we would have the right to terminate the lease. Terminate the conservation easement.
Right.
If, on the other hand, we determine at Clayton, if the golf course lease was not renewed, I actually believe we'll end up in the same collaborative process we started a long time ago. As Charlotte said, we've had these conversations for 5-6 years. But certainly Clayton's not waiving any rights regarding the permanent taking and whether or not it interferes with the ability to operate an 18-hole regulation golf course and driving range. And certainly we can't waive those rights. As Charlotte explained, we are here on behalf of the kids that Clayton represents, and we can't give up those rights. But in terms of the temporary itself, no, that would not lead to the termination you've asked.
Okay, I appreciate you putting that on the record, and I think the more we can separate out questions into really distinct parts, it's going to be helpful for our debate here on the floor. So that's why I'm asking such narrow questions. So we heard a community concern. Could it be, triggered based on the temporary loss? We're hearing no. And then the question about the permanent loss is one we can debate based on the many golf courses. So I would just like to pull up someone from the team. Can you confirm for me the number of golf courses you have researched that have included detention as part of a golf course design? Give me some sense of, regionally what you've looked at. Just give, and real, 2 minutes. Don't give me 10 minutes, but just really quickly. There is a precedent for using a golf course for drainage.
Yeah, Jason Rutt with the P2P project team. We're doing this in City Park Golf Course right now. So there's one just adjacent to it where we've been able to do this.
That one's not done yet, though. So let's choose one that's done.
One that's done.
Let me do that.
There's a number in Arizona that we've researched. This is something that is done outside of Colorado quite a bit. Arizona is a place that has a climate much like Denver where they get large rainstorms and they use public assets like golf courses for detention. So this is something that we've seen in a number of locations and we've done research. We currently are in the process of looking at how that golf course would lay out with that detention, and there's ways to shape the detention to make the golf course work.
Okay, thank you for that. And this is my last question. Thanks, Mr. President. Yes.
Happy.
Thank you. Councilwoman Happy Haynes, Executive Director of Denver Parks and Recreation. We did some research on this topic, and I don't have the paper in front of me, but we have 7 golf courses, and at least 5 of those golf courses contain some amount of storm drainage.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So one more question, if I may, and this one's for John, the attorney. The other question I heard from members of the testimony was about development. And I think I understand where their confusion comes from, because this conversation changed so quickly in the course of a month. We were talking about the potential development. I want to take us back to the ordinance that we're on tonight, which is about the purchase. And so I want to just ask you if you can read, do you have the agreement in front of you?
Which agreement is that?
The land acquisition ordinance?
I don't have the ordinance in front of me.
Okay,
But
well, can you refer to the limitations in the land acquisition ordinance? For what purposes are we authorizing, if this passes tonight, for what purposes would we be authorizing any acquisition of any land on this golf course?
right, it's storm drainage, detention, and conveyance.
Okay. And I'm going to ask a question I usually don't ask in open forum, but I'm going to ask you to answer it anyway. If the city acquired land under this ordinance and then used it for development, sold it to a developer, or did something, what were the potential consequences the city could face?
I'd have to research what the consequences would be, but the purposes for the acquisition would need to be tied to the detention and conveyance of stormwater.
Let's just say this. If we acquired the land and conveyed it to a developer or conducted development on the land, would it be legal under the way this ordinance is drafted?
I think not. It is not uncommon for an acquisition under a land acquisition ordinance to allow for certain remnants of property to be conveyed to third parties. But by and large, that could not be done.
Okay. So there would be legal risk to the city
Yes.
if we were to proceed with this ordinance and then somehow sneakily give the land away
Correct.
at some point based on how it's written. Okay. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right. Thank you, Councilwoman Kniech. Councilman Espinoza.
Councilwoman Kniech, I appreciate the questions, but they sort of miss some intrinsic facts, but they touch on them, and I think it's worth getting those facts out. Currently, the agreement with Clayton and the golf course provider provides how much money per year to Clayton?
So the legal lease contract between us and Arcis Golf is it, pardon me, it's a flat $700,000 a year.
And then if they do exercise their extension, does that amount change or remain the same?
They have the right to re-up that lease under the exact same terms that are in it now.
So we're looking at 700,000 times 6 is the sort of maximum amount of money that Clayton could have coming to it?
They actually have the option to re-up for 2 5-year periods, so that would be 10 years.
So a total of 11 years. This year, the last remaining year plus the 2 5-year extensions, so 11 years, so $7.7 million is what is essentially, already agreed to if they re-upped twice.
Only if they re-up, yes.
The question, your attorney seemed to imply that, you would defer that question of development to a later date. I believe that the question of development is already deferred to a very date specific in the future. When does the agency agreement, the conservation agency agreement and the conservation easement that would be in place if the agency agreement were in place, when does that terminate?
There is no termination. It's a contract between the two parties. It could be amended or changed.
No, there's a
no
date of
termination in it.
October of 2099. It's a 99-year conservation easement. I mean, not a 99-year conservation easement, but it goes until 2099. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
So if all the terms of the agreement that you have with us and Clayton entered into for the $2 million that was paid in 1994 were met and honored, we would not be having a discussion about development on there until 2099. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. I need to confer with my attorney. I don't quite even understand the question, so.
I mean, there's an agreement in place. If we honor all the terms of the agreement and we don't do anything to disrupt the actual resulting in any sort of termination or cancellation of the easement, that an easement would be, the land would be subject to either golf use or open space till the year 2099.
Not necessarily.
Okay, so what are the other options?
Sure. In part, the term conservation easement is a little misleading to folks, because normally they think of conservation easements. They think of agricultural conservation easements that have certain IRS tax benefits, and those truly run in perpetuity and extremely difficult to unwind a conservation easement for which a party has obtained tax benefits. When people ask me what this agreement really is, I explain to them it's a use restriction. It's a use restriction between two parties, the city and Clayton. And so at any time between now and 2099, even if we didn't have the condemnation action, Clayton could come forward to the city and ask permission to have that easement released in order to sustain the goals of serving the children that it protects. And so it is a contract between the city and Clayton, like any other contract that the city has, that can be amended. It can only be amended, though, importantly, taking, per your question, moving the condemnation question to the side, absent a condemnation, it can only be amended by an action by this city council. So that's why I was suggesting you are deferring this decision to another day. Because not only would, if there was never a condemnation action, it would take an action by this city council to release it, and further another action by the city council to approve whatever development plan might be proposed by Clayton. And so to me, no, the question would likely always come up, because I think what people tend to forget is when this was put in place in 1999, the golf industry was far different. I don't think anyone sitting on the council at that time realized that the possibility that for the last 10 years, our golf course operator has lost money. This is not a sustainable economic operation. And so if this Ordinance 1396 never came forward, we would still be coming to this council at some point to explain that the golf course, the golf course operators always told us they don't intend to renew, and we've been told in the marketplace that $700,000 will dwindle if we have to go out and find a new golf course operator in 2019.
That conservation easement came in consideration of $2 million for the city and county of Denver. Do you then intend, if you ever were to really, to negotiate terms to remove the conservation easement, would that come with money back to the city and county of Denver in exchange for the development rights that you're trying to reacquire?
I think what you're talking about is a sliver of what an entire community conversation would be. And we've started that community conversation, and we have engaged the community.
But have you,
have
you engaged the community in earnest? Because the land is currently zoned OSA, is it not?
Yes.
And what development rights exist on OSA today?
No present development rights exist on the property.
And so have you been clear that there is conservation easement and protections that are reflected in that current zone district, so that you're limited in development rights today due to an agreement that you made with the city and county of Denver in consideration for money from the city and county of Denver?
We have been very open with the community. We have shared copies of the agency agreement and the conservation easement. We've explained the right of the golf course operator to renew. We've explained their right of first refusal to match an offer. We've gone through all that with the community, and the PCAC, is the acronym they use, has been very engaged in the process. And so to ask the question, would the money come back from the conservation easement, I think is just a start of the question. The question really is, what does this community want? What would a future development do to serve the needs of Clayton and the community? And that's a conversation that will come back before this council many times.
The real struggle I have with that answer is that is not, to the Councilwoman Kniech's point, we're in a very different place than where this came to us back in September, where we were not talking at all in these terms. What we were talking about is a quitclaim transaction that basically granted the development the ability to remove these conservation easement and then buy back this land for considerably higher value without any discussion about the fact that there were all these other encumbrances and things that we were jumping over. We were doing all these things to sort of circumvent a lot of things. And so the concern that you hear here is legitimate, which is, did we just find another way to get the same outcome, but using sort of legal parlance and nuance of rules in a way to sort of get the same outcome? And what I'm struggling with is that one document that I shouldn't have had, that appraisal that shows that the value of that land as golf course land is $3 million, and that value of that land as development right is $24 million. And somewhere in there, in the 7.7 that this developer golf course operator might pay you over the course of 11 years, is probably a number that makes them comfortable with leaving that operation. And then you having the excuse to basically say, our operator left, it is no longer functional as a 18-hole golf course, and now we want to exercise this right because we've lost the land. And so we will then, by voting this as is, without the guarantees that were simply asked, and we could ask it of the city, and we could ask it of Clayton right now, will you guarantee that we will not do anything that alters the conservation easement that we have in place until this project is done and we have a much more public negotiation, and dialogue about the future of that land and the real value of Clayton to this community and what we're going to invest in it as a community, and that land is open space.
Councilman, is that a question?
So are you guys willing to make that commitment? The guarantee that was asked for by Mr. Guernsey?
Well, we answered Councilwoman Kniech's question by saying that we would not assert that the temporary taking triggers a termination of the conservation easement. On behalf of the kids that Clayton represents, no, it cannot stand here today and say that the permanent condemnation does not create that right. Because to do that would really put in jeopardy everything that Mrs. Brantly described to you about the purpose of the trust, what they do in the community. We've heard lots of conversation about that tonight, and that would be really a breach of the fiduciary duty of the board if they agreed to that tonight.
To be honest, I actually wonder if I'm even concerned, if I share these concerns. The reason being is this, that the conservation easement actually isn't in place today. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's only triggered if Clayton comes forward and asks to reacquire the property.
Right, and so that step has to happen first, right? I mean, so is even any concern about a conservation easement not being enforced? I mean, there's other actions that have to occur because the conservation easement that we're talking about doesn't even apply to the land today as we know it. So, I mean,
correct. Okay. Are you done, Councilman?
I do have some questions for our own staff about contamination, but I'll wait.
That's for 39th Avenue?
Yeah.
Okay, that's at the next bill. This is 1396. I got Councilwoman Ortega up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to shift the discussion a little bit and kind of hone in on the budget. And I'm looking at an old notification that I was cleaning out some boxes and dumping out files, and this was in my water bill. And you know, sometimes you get your wastewater bill with your water bill. And this was in 2011. There was, it went into effect in July, so the council that departed before some of us came on in 2011 made the decisions about a rate increase to the wastewater fees. So in 2011, it went up 20%. In 2012, it went up 2%, and in 2013, it went up 2%. And one of the projects on here was Park Hill. This project was initiated following the August 17, 2000 drowning of fireman Bob Crump. Some of you may remember that. He went through a culvert trying to save someone, a woman who had slipped into that culvert. And so, you know, it was important for the city to begin to address this. But what is not clear to me is exactly how much money was spent and what exactly did that cover. What this says is to date, and this is again going back to 2011, 17 million of storm drainage improvements and detention pond have been installed in this area. And this was around 50th and Colorado generally, but there were some other improvements in that sort of quadrant of the city. So I'm not sure who's the right person that can answer my question about what did the 2011 rate increase that followed with the next 3 consecutive years, which was before the wastewater increase that was approved by some of the folks on this dais when we did the rate increase to the tune of $300 million.
Bruce Jahernick with Denver Public Works, long-range storm planning. I'll try to answer your question first. Happy New Year. I don't think anyone said that yet. But so you're right, Councilwoman. The Park Hill project has been on our radar since about 2000 with the tragedy at 50th in Colorado. We build these systems from downstream to upstream. So we started with the Park Hill Pond, which is at the northernmost point. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was around $2 to $3 million back in the day. And then we started to build the pipe system upstream. I think there has been 3 or 4 phases. The third phase got us to about 48th and Colorado. And now then the fourth phase was along 48th from Colorado to Dahlia, and that's where we are today. And the fifth phase, which we want to start construction now, is going to take us in Dahlia from 48th to the RTD tracks. So all told, between the Park Hill Pond and the pipes that have got us up to about 48th and Dahlia, it's been about $20 million. So that was funds that were even predated the 2011 rate increase. But the 2011 rate increase allowed us to do, I believe, the phase 4 construction.
Okay. So as we look at the budget now for Park Hill Golf Course, it's a $78 million. That's what we have in our contract. Let me make sure I'm not confusing the two bills here.
Yeah, that's the same.
Okay, so 95 has the $78 million, but that includes acquisition for both the 39th Avenue Channel as well as the Park Hill Golf Course, correct? That, at least that's what I understood from a meeting I had today with city staff.
The $78 million, which would be $13.95, and we'll talk about that later in detail, but that's for the construction of the channel, and the budget that we're talking about for the Park Hill Golf Course is contained within the real estate budget, which would cover the cost of the permanent easement, temporary easement, and reconstructing it back to a playable golf course.
Okay, that's not consistent with what I thought I heard today. So yes, I was told $60,500,000 was part of real estate, but I was also told that the $78 million budget included part of the acquisition for Park Hill. And then I later tried to get clarification on separating out the acquisition for Park Hill versus what we were acquiring for the 39th Avenue Channel. And you shared with me that $21 million is what we're looking at for the construction for Park Hill.
Correct.
And then we're looking at $10.7 million for the real estate for Park Hill.
Yeah, so what we were talking about today is we have the $78 million, which is for the SEMA contract.
Right.
And that is purely for the construction and implementation of 39th Avenue Greenway, as well as Park Hill Golf Course. So you remember the document that we were looking at, we had
right
the one line item. And then at the bottom, we had the line item for the real estate, and that's what Jeff was referring to. So the real estate budget is separate from that SEMA contract, and that's been used for the acquisition and relocation of the properties along 39th Avenue as well as Park Hill.
So the total cost that's going to be spent on the golf course improvements, which is construction and then restoration,
Right.
is in excess of the $21 million, because part of that is built into the $78 million. Is that correct?
So the $21 million covers the portion of Park Hill, which isn't just the golf course, it's also the pipes that are connecting to the outfall and connecting the Holly Pond to the golf course detention. So there's that portion. So that's all included in the $21.6 million. So that's all what SEMA will be constructing. And what Jeff was saying is he has that separate budget, which is the $10.7 million, which covers the acquisition costs for the temporary easement, the permanent easement, as well as the restoration costs for the golf course.
So we're acquiring both the temporary and a permanent easement for the golf course.
That's correct.
Okay.
Jeff can
So
punch me if I'm-
one of the things I'm looking at, and the reason I wanted to look at the entirety of the budget of the plat to Park Hill, which originally we were told was the Twin Basin Drainage Project, but the name changed later, was to really just kind of do a comparison. So when you look at the total cost of what we're going to spend on City Park Golf Course, that is basically $45 million.
Correct.
And I know that's a complete redo. What's not clear to me is how much of a complete renovation we're doing of Park Hill Golf Course to return it back to Clayton in a usable format that continues to make it marketable to the current vendor or anybody else in the future.
Right. So the intent would be it's much different than City Park Golf Course, because you're correct, City Park Golf Course, we are redoing the entire golf course. So this would be the holes that would be impacted by the detention, and there may be some relocation of those holes, but it's not covering the entire golf course. It's really just in that detention area.
Which is primarily that far northeast corner of the golf course.
Yep.
Okay, and so we have been told over and over, we're looking at anywhere from 20 to 25 acres. The language that is in the contract, and I'm not finding the page number, that speaks to 90 acres. I just want to be clear that that is specific to the golf course and that doesn't include the 39th Avenue channel as well?
Yeah, that's correct. The amount that is proposed for the golf course is between 25 and 35 acres of permanent easement and between 55 and 65 acres of temporary easement. And that comprises the 90 acres that you're referring to.
Okay. I have one other question that I want to ask of the folks from Clayton, and either one of you can come up. So in, let me just find my note here for a minute. So in, at the time that the easement was placed on that property, the conservation easement, that was a $2 million revenue to the Clayton Trust, right? And was the land that was developed on where there's new housing at that far north end of the golf course, was that done before or after that easement was put into place? Was that sold after?
There's actually two areas of land that used to all be part of the golf course. You just spoke to the north end. If you're talking about what's at 40th and Colorado on up to Smith Road.
Yes.
That area was actually sold off by the city of Denver when the city was the trustee of the Clayton Trust, before Clayton Early Learning was even incorporated as a 501c3 that we are today. The other area that was sold off by Clayton Early Learning, after it was incorporated, we were incorporated in the mid-'80s, became an institution in the mid-'80s. In the 90s, the area that is now the overlook at Park Hill, that was sold off to KB Homes by the institution that I currently run today as president and CEO. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. That's helpful. Okay. And at that time, are you able to share what that was sold for at that point in time?
I do not know. I would have to find that out for you. It was long before my time there. Okay. But I'm sure we could find that out.
That was done in the 90s. Mm-hmm. Okay. At this point, I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Councilman Espinoza, you back up.
Two questions, one for Maria Flora and one for Mr. Armijo. All right, is Maria Flora still here?
Yes, she is coming in the back here.
Maria, what were your observations of 1218 that you...
I'm sorry, who's talking to me? I'm sorry.
What were your observations of FinGov on 1218?
I'm sorry.
Observations?
What were your observations of FinGov, the committee meeting of December 18th?
Well, I was concerned, let me dig that out, because Councilman Flynn asked, let's see, Mr. Feinberg, am I saying that right? Steinberg, what the effect of the permanent easement, part of this is a permanent easement, which is why I'm still concerned. Part of it's a temporary easement. As I understand, the permanent easement is the part that the detention's going to be on. Mm-hmm. So he was asked what effect that had on the conservation easement. And the city said, there's a provision in the conservation easement that says if there's something that's done that precludes us from being a regulation golf course, that the conservation easement can be terminated. As a result, we looked at it and said, okay, we need to bring this back to a playable golf course. So from the onset, we worked with Public Works and let them know that we have to do that, and that was what desire and intent is, and by virtue of bringing it back to being a playable golf course, the conservation easement, Councilman Flynn said, stays in effect, and the answer was yes. My concern remains that I don't think we've nailed down Clayton College, and if it's a permanent easement, does what they said tonight still apply? And if you look at the letter of the conservation easement, it can be terminated.
At the committee meeting, did you see even a schematic diagram of what was being proposed as far as the detention location?
I can't remember.
Jeff, was one presented?
I don't know that it was a specific schematic. I think that there was the general area that was identified as the northeast portion where water already detains.
And just as a reminder, because for everyone's, I don't think it's confidential. I saw a schematic design layout, very, not even preliminary, right? Because there's no design yet. That is part of the transaction that would have to occur in the contracts. But one thing that I can say comfortably is between the current depression in the golf course and the planned, meaning where there's already a low spot, I am convinced that you know the detention could be captured in an 18-hole golf course, and you confirmed that at the last hearing. But could you confirm again that the amount of stormwater that needs to be detained on site can still be captured in an 18-hole golf course? The regulation golf course can still be maintained.
I'm a real estate guy. I think that an engineer needs to answer that question.
Is there somebody? Yeah, we have an engineer. He's in the back, or he's over there.
If I can answer part of your question, maybe what was said is that there'd be 25 to 35 acres for the permanent construction easement.
Use your mic,
Use your
please.
mic right here.
I'm sorry, what was said was there would be 25 to 35 acres for the permanent construction easement for the detention, and then 55 to 65 acres for the temporary construction easement for the rest of the golf course.
And this is maybe you can answer both of these, because I think the first question is, can you guys confirm that we can in fact design the required stormwater detention, capture the amount of acreage, water that we want to capture, and still maintain an 18-hole regulation golf course? And then can you address the fact that I believe that even if there's a permanent easement, we can still make it so that it's playable, correct?
Yes, so the first question on the golf course being restored with the detention incorporated, obviously we're not to a point where we have 100% design, but we're confident that we can get to that point, just based on what we were talking about earlier, that there's a lot of precedents around the country where that's incorporated, and we're working with our partners at SEMA to make sure that the detention gets designed and incorporated into that golf course. The permanent easement, and Jeff, interrupt me if I'm wrong, but from the permanent easement standpoint, it would not interfere with the golf course plan.
Yeah, and so I want people to sort of separate the project from this transaction, because there are, to me, legitimate concerns about the sort of viability in this whole deal, about the viability of the conservation easement. But what I am fairly certain, convinced of, and I think you guys have proven capable, is delivering an 18-hole golf course. Now, whether that's viable for the operator to sustain months or years without full playability is, but that gets to my last question for Jeff is, how do you determine the amount of compensation that is needed to sort of lost revenue?
It'll be a combination of negotiations. What we first have to do is bring in an appraiser to come up with the valuation of what the value of the permanent easement is on the 25 to 35 acres, and then the same thing on the temporary construction easement. And then as we get to design, So there's a couple of aspects there. It'll be June or July 1st when design of the detention in and of itself is put on the table and finalized. So there'll be a construction timeline associated with that, and at the same time we'll be working with the golf course architect that will look at how we bring the golf course back to a playable golf course. So between the two, I think what we had in the presentation was from January of 19 till March of 20 would be the period of time that the golf course would be out of operation. I would imagine that with seeding and bringing it back to use, it would probably take it into June-ish of 20 before it could be operated as a golf course. So that would be the period that would be looked at for replacement income.
So then again, for my own understanding of the timeline, if you now know the approximate window that the course would be down and the duration, what is preventing you from doing an appraisal and coming up with that number so that we knew that going into it to sort of find out where the, why do we have to actually execute all this now? Is this because of some deliverable to CDOT on detention and the IGA or not?
No, I mean, as we sit today, we don't have the right to go negotiate or to do an appraisal on somebody else's property. I mean, the property is owned by the Clayton Trust, and what we would need to do, and that's what we're seeking for in the land acquisition ordinance, is the right to send a notice of intent letter saying that we plan on acquiring the easements that we need.
I don't understand how we can be in negotiations with Clayton for 6 years under the pretense that they might lose their operator and not be, in such a collegial environment that we couldn't actually sort of work together on that. And
so we haven't been in negotiations with them for 6 years. We've been in discussions with them because this has been a topic where we've looked at, and again, as we had back in September, there was the potential where we could potentially have looked at buying a portion of the golf course, but we have to respect the contracts that are in place, and the contract that's in place is with the golf course operator. That goes to the end of this year, but it also goes until the end of June 30th, or until June 30th, when they have to come up with a decision of whether or not they're going to extend their option. So we have to have all those things in place and can't take them out of order.
okay, thank you. Mr. Armijo, what was your proclamation?
Thank you. I'm hard of hearing, so could you please kind of speak up? And the hearing aids they gave me.
What was your proclamation?
DNA test to citizens living within 2 miles radius of the 39th P project. If any citizen tests positive for levels of benzoaprine, lead, asbestos, arsenic, etc., because we know what's in that property, 0.1% above normal EPA standards, the project will come to a complete halt, and full EPA testing of the soil and cleanup will begin in the 39th Avenue project area. Every 3 months after the cleanup has been done, or if they said they were fine, every 3 months or 6 months, do a DNA test for the next 10 years. If they would have done DNA test on us, I wouldn't be in the situation I am today. They would have. Number two, I'm concerned about all the kids because the majority of people that moved into that neighborhood that I've talked to, even the ones living there today, moved there because they got tired of New York City, living in San Francisco. They found their sweet little bungalows. Now they are barely finding out they're going to destroy all of Northeast Denver in the name of the almighty dollar. Now, the reason I know about DNA testing, because I was on a top secret island in the South Pacific. They didn't tell us what was on there, but I got everything from Vietnam to Johnson Atoll. These kids, in their study, said the Mexicans, which are Mexicanos from Mexico, were not intelligent enough to know English at the same time. Their kids were slower learners because of lead paint and whatever else the highway produces. If you do a DNA test based on the existing chemicals that we, as residents, have either read about or know about, you would be able to have a chart for these families and have the families a way to have the city of Denver, all the contractors, like they did with Rocky Flats, to pay for any medical issues. I've lived in that neighborhood since 1960. I lived in East Denver since the day I was born. Every time the city wants to do something, I helped them clean it up in the 90s and 2000, and they promised us they're going to clean up the area, they're going to put us a park. None of that ever happened, but now all of a sudden they're saying, oh, we need the land. And I worked hard for the city for free as a volunteer. From cleaning up the drugs, prostitution, I bought my mother's house for $18,000 with no intentions of ever moving out of there or having a monetary value on it. All the neighbors know me as either Grandpa Ed or the mayor of Cole, where I live, because I know so much about that neighborhood. I've been on the internet, I've been federal government, the EPA. Nobody can produce a physical record of Gardner, Denver, which is the rock drill, aka Gardner, Denver. Each one of them parking facilities, that all belong to Gardner, Denver. I used to work for Gardner, Denver in the 80s. We used petroleum products to cool the metal. That's poison now. I could not find documentation on 39th Avenue where Old Man Church told me there's gas tanks buried there, etc.
So, not to be rude, but you are in fact opening up Pandora's box.
That's my point. It is a Pandora's box from my experiment with the government.
Well, no,
I don't
but
trust anybody but you and you on that city council, because you reason with people. Elvis is always trying to cut me off.
No, but I'll just be honest. We have verifiable, documentable, different health outcomes.
I don't believe that. I worked at the refinery for 26 years. Because of my illness, I had to take a medical retirement.
Right, but
they said the refinery was cleaned up, but we had a big old benzene caper, and some of the guys already died.
Exposures can happen so many different ways, and I don't deny that is in fact. There is a definite history in certain parts of North Denver and East Denver, and populations with long prolonged exposures have definitely had health impacts, and generational health impacts over there.
Councilman, I got Ortega.
Okay, so I just wanted you to know
we're way off of the Park Hill.
that it's not there, you know. Okay. I'd be happy to talk to you after
I'd
this.
I'd appreciate if you talk to me, because I could tell you stuff. If you listen to reason, you would put this project on a screeching halt. I'm not dumb. I know a lot about chemicals and the refining, naval, nuclear industry with all my work. I worked for Gardner, Denver in a machine shop, worked at the refinery as an industrial mechanic. They even found an ancient Indian where they
Armijo,
said nobody was there.
Mr. Armijo,
thank you.
We're going to Mrs. Councilwoman Ortega. This is my neighbor, by the way, so I have heard all these stories. But Councilwoman Ortega?
Thank you. I just have two more quick questions. So the first one is for, is Happy Haynes still here? Happy, would you mind coming forward? My question is, I know we went through this whole process when, shortly after the, I can't even think of the name of the park in far southeast Denver, but that drew attention to the fact that we had a number of undedicated parks, and then we learned that there were certain parks we couldn't dedicate because we had conservation easements on there. So do you have a ballpark idea of how many parks or park land that we own that have conservation easements on them?
No, I don't, Councilwoman Ortega, off the top of my head. And those would be owned by someone else other than the city with a conservation easement, but for public access. So, trying to think of an example.
I know we have one up at, it's next to Heron Pond, and that land was purchased with natural resource damage funds from the SARCO.
That's a great example. That's a state-owned facility, and there's a conservation easement on that property.
So we're required to keep that as open space. It's part of our master planning that we're doing.
And it's not owned by, it's owned by another, someone besides the city.
Yeah,
That's correct.
okay. So it would be helpful at some point to just know that, because I think it would be...
we do have that. I just don't have it in front of me.
Right, and I didn't expect you to answer that exact number tonight. But the fact that there are other easements on there owned by other entities means that we, the city, cannot turn around and try to dispose of that land that has an easement that we have no control of.
I think every easement is different, so it would, I mean, generally that would be true, but every easement is different, so we would have to look at each one to determine what the conditions are.
And I know you've been in Northeast Denver for as long as you and I've known each other forever.
Yeah, don't say, please.
Do you recall, and I'm going to ask Clayton to answer this question, why the easement was put on the Park Hill Golf Course? It's my recollection, I could be wrong about this, that it was because of the revenue that they were generating that they would have been taxed on. But by putting the conservation easement on there, it precluded them from being taxed for that revenue that was coming in from the private operator. Is that?
No, I don't recall. I mean, there were obviously, I don't know if it was the conservation easement that address the tax issues or not, and
Okay, let me ask Clayton to just address that.
Yeah.
Because it's an easement that the city acquired, but it's not clear what that easement currently does, what access that gives us.
If I may, Councilwoman, I'll start, and then if I get in trouble, I'm going to have Bruce come back up here. So there are actually two different things at work here. One was the contract between the city and Clayton where the $2 million was exchanged. And at that point in time, as Bruce had mentioned earlier, golf was a good economic use of that property, and so it made a lot of sense to have it remain golf. That was 20-some-odd years ago now that was looked at in that way. The agency agreement, which is a separate, it's a contract between us and the city. That came along a few years later. The agency agreement is what addresses the tax issue, the property tax issue.
Okay,
not
thank
the
you for that clarification. Okay, Council President, I have no further questions.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Seeing no other questions on 1396, we're now going to move into the comment portion and close 1396. So comments by members of council. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. You're going to do comments before questions on 95, correct? Thank you. 2 weeks ago when we had this on first reading, I offered an amendment to clarify the authority of the administration to go ahead and acquire permanent and temporary easements, and as necessary for random parcels around those easements to acquire by fee simple, because fee simple acquisition was included in there. And we understood that that's not the intent, but I was very concerned that by including the authority to acquire up to 90 acres for stormwater, drainage, detention, et cetera, in fee simple, that we were putting a foot in the door, camel's nose in the tent, whatever you want to call it, without having to come back to the City Council if, in fact, the decision was to acquire by fee simple rather than easement. And because of that, Mr. President, I can't vote yes on this ordinance. I have to vote no. The other reason is that I believe 90 acres is much more than we talked about in the beginning. We were talking initially about a 25-acre detention area and whatever might be needed for temporary construction easements. 90 acres is just much, much too much for me to approve. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilman Flynn. Councilman Herndon, would you like to go at the end, or?
No, Mr. President, I have no comments.
Okay. Councilwoman Kniech.
Thank you, Mr. President. I referenced in my common question, we are good at mushing them together here, the fact that this has been a messy process, and I think, I just think the city does actually have to take responsibility for, entering into a legal negotiation without adequate information about the operator as well as Clayton. We should not have had an agreement on the verge of council adoption without that clarified much more definitively. And it has created so much confusion and fear. This would have been a totally different conversation had we not ended up there. So I think both parties bear responsibility for that. And I think part of what we all need to do in public service or in community service is take that responsibility. So that is unfortunate. And I really do understand why the community has the concerns it has, because that is the conversation we were having just a couple months ago. And if that agreement were before me, I'm not sure that I would have been able to support it. But I am trying hard, in spite of that mess and in spite of our failure to do our proper due diligence, to really separate out just this particular proposal before me. And, based on really a very clear ordinance that really limits the use of this land for the drainage purpose. That is the only thing we can acquire for. And I respect in some ways Councilman Flynn's, desire to not have fee simple versus an easement, but the effect is the same. Really, whether the city, for some legal quirk, has to acquire it in fee simple or for legal quirk has to do it as an easement, if in the end it's only for drainage, and if the end it has to be put back as a golf course, it's just a distinction without a difference. It's not something I hear from the community that you all care about. So I think I've tried to zero my questions in on the things that I have heard that people care about, because I think those things are really important. And so I appreciate Clayton being very firm about the fact that they are not using this agreement, or I'm sorry, this ordinance as an excuse to trigger, a condemnation clause for temporary loss of the golf course. I'm sure there will be all kinds of interesting and heated debates about how to protect the kids' interest in revenue and the value of land, but that's all governed by a really strict process. So I feel like I've done the due diligence that the community has asked me to do, that this land will be used for open space and only for open space. And so, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. It should be used for drainage. I'm sorry, it'll be used for drainage. It's late. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little muddled. And so, and that we have the protections in place for the next phase. It is incumbent upon the city to deliver land that can be used as a golf course, right? And so, and I feel like I have gotten enough, and this is where, Councilman Espinoza and I seem to be in agreement that there is ample evidence that this can be done. And so because of that ample evidence, there should never, ever be a triggering of the condemnation clause. If it can be built as a golf course, the condemnation clause never gets triggered. So the two are linked, and because there is ample evidence that it can be restored to a golf course, I feel confident moving this forward. And, I appreciate the speaker who, echoed my words from committee, but I'll just do it in my own words tonight, which is that let's not do this again with bad process. So if and when you hear from Arcis, or if I'm saying the name properly, of your golf course operator, we need really good communication with the community and with this council about how design is proceeding and how it's impacting decisions that you're making and things like that. I would ask that council get briefings on the confidential negotiations that are occurring. We seriously underuse executive sessions as this body. We should get a committee executive session to understand how negotiations are going on this discussion about this acquisition as it proceeds. It's highly public interest oriented, And it's just not appropriate for you to negotiate an entire agreement and then tell us about it at the end when there is so much confusion and challenge. So I would ask that you give us briefings. So with all of those, kind of due diligences and all of those requests to make sure that we stay a part of this conversation in an ongoing way, I appreciate that my questions have been answered, and I will be voting to move this forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilwoman Kniech. Councilman Espinoza, you're up.
I wish I could go there because it's a good stormwater project and a good way to incorporate this at relatively minimal impact. The problem is that we have this history of sort of protracted discussion about developing land that is not developable by design. It is a fallacy to sort of sit here and opine that we chose a golf course because that was a good sort of revenue generator back then, and no longer is it. And now we need to change, because that decision to make a golf course was in part because of the outcry for the open space. And so that was a sort of compromise that we were going to, we'll do this in exchange. We will use this open space like a revenue generator in exchange for not losing complete development opportunity here. It was sort of it wasn't that, but it was a negotiation with the community at that time that basically said, look, here's a good compromise, a way you guys can have open space, or at least that natural element, and we could generate revenue. And to sort of say that we're going to use whatever mechanism now to sort of to throw away those agreements of the past. And no one's sort of saying that, but what we are doing is creating a clear path for that, because of what we talked about. There is no easement in place today, but what there is an agency agreement. And that agency agreement allows them to terminate that agreement in writing at any point in time. At any time. They could have done it 2 years ago. They could have done it 5 years ago. They could do it tomorrow. But they'll probably, if they're smart, they'll wait. They'll wait until it's clear that there's going to be some sort of agreement with their operator. And so when you do, they'll file the termination, and then the next action is they have to put the conservation easement in place. That is a requirement of that agency agreement. So when they terminate, they have to put in the agency agreement, the conservation easement. And now, because their golf course operator says that we can't use it, and that the amount of money that the city's not going to give us isn't enough for us to endure 2 years and go on, they have the conditions to get rid of the conservation easement, and now, lo and behold, the development rights are there. Well, the city's already made very clear by virtue of the action back in September that we've got a deal, we've got a way to sort of promise upwards of $24 million to purchase that land with development rights. It's not good for us to buy open space for the cheap. We want to buy land that is developable. Open space that City of Denver residents fought for, earned and got this agreement and paid for 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. And so what I've always maintained, and I'll be transparent with you all, is I might be okay with that if we could sort of create a win-win for Clayton and a win for open space and a win for community, because there's definite needs and desires for certain uses there. It's definite infrastructure investment that we've made as people in the city and state over there. And so there might be opportunity. But if you're going to have that much open space and capture that much value, I want a commitment that that money that goes to redevelopment of open space goes back into purchase and acquisition of even more open space in this city. This is, and why that, and that might disturb some people going, well, wait a sec, you're going to sell Park Hill? That's at a time when we're going to build the 39th Avenue Channel next to our biggest park in the city. You know, we have an equity issue on open space. And I think there's a way to sort of, to do it more thoughtfully. But that's not what's happening here. All to Councilwoman Kniech's point, this happens so opaquely that council does not know until it's time to go. 6 years of negotiation. I don't know how many members of council knew that this was been going on for 6 years. You know, this council has asked for real estate updates in executive session, a master plan, some sort of knowledge about what it is that we have as assets, what we're playing with, what we're exploring, and why. But we don't. The only way to know that is in a strong mayor government, have that seat on the third floor. And the best we can do is what you're seeing here. And fortunately, this is a situation where the community knew better. INC came out with facts, and people came out in droves. And so to Chairman Siku's comments, I've been on that side just 2.5 years ago, right? And I've been right on that side. And this is a situation where, once again, you guys know better than we do. And so I'm mindful of that. We have oversight authority. That is our job. That is our lone, strong power as council, is to prove or deny these sorts of deals. There's stronger provisions that we could be making for the health and safety and environment, and I'm sort of spilling into my 39th Avenue channel things, but they apply here because we're talking about open space, and that is so critical to well-being. And that is so much why we live in Denver, is the quality of life. And to that community, that low income, I mean, the affordable community that is restricted next to this asset, I mean, that is an incredible asset. Not many low income communities next to a golf course. You know, and so we did that. Clayton did that willfully. And now we're doing this sort of deal to get out of it, sort of, leveraging people, getting people riled up for what the potential is, when that potential doesn't exist unless we do a whole bunch of other machinations to make it happen. And so let's be transparent about that and say, here's what it's going to take. Here's what we're asking you, City of Denver. Do you guys want your assets, your monies, your fees in stormwater, your tax dollars in general revenue funds to go to this level of investment to support one organization, which is very worthwhile? And if so, to what degree? And then what do you want to do with your open space? That the city's doing that, but we're not doing that. That's Clayton doing that. And that's just disingenuous. And that is not how we should be operating as far as I'm concerned. So because that is, in fact, the narrative that I'm throwing out, and I could be totally wrong in 3 years' time, 4 years' time. I'm willing to be that. But if I'm totally right, you've got this point to remember it by. Thanks. I'll be voting no.
All right, Councilwoman Black.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be voting yes. This bill is not going to end in the development of the golf course. It's actually a practical solution with an environmental benefit. One of the speakers talked about the importance of green space. Well, the Park Hill Golf Course will still be a green space. And under this bill, the green space will also be a green solution for a major flooding problem. And we've been talking about this for a year, and I know the Common Ground Golf Course is an example of drainage. The Lakewood Golf Course is an example of drainage. We've asked about that in committee meetings. It's a green way to deal with drainage issues. So as Councilwoman Kniech brought up, this bill is not going to result in all of the things that a lot of people are worried about. It's really just going to allow for this drainage to be built, and it will remain open space. In the future, I'm confident that Charlotte Brantly and the Clayton Trust, in partnership with the city and the community, will then work toward a community vision. I have the utmost confidence in Charlotte Brantly. I know she cares passionately about her community, so I will be supporting this.
All right. Thank you, Councilman Black. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. President. You can include me on the team that feels it's a little bit too muddled for my taste, starting back with, as Councilwoman Kniech pointed out, how in the name of all that is holy and sacred, we get a contract that we're getting ready to vote on and nobody's talked to the golf course operator. It just feels like there's too much. I don't believe everything's on the table. I don't think council has been given the entire truth about what the plans are, either by Clayton, and I have great respect for the work that Clayton does for the kids in the community and the families. I have no problem with that. But I just don't believe either the administration or Clayton has presented the plans that already exist on their tables for our consideration. Another thing that concerns me greatly, what I heard the most definite from all the speakers tonight was from the attorney for Clayton, and that their responsibility is to their fiduciary responsibility to the Clayton Trust, and that's fine. I understand that. But that's what I hear a lot more firmly than any commitment to preservation of open space. Another thing that bothers me is I believe that the timeline for all of this is not driven by concerns for the community, but by the need to build this drainage project in agreement with dates that we've committed to with the Department of Transportation to not hold up the I-70 project. And I think that's affecting issues relating to both of the projects that we're considering tonight, that both could do with being cooked a little bit longer. So I will not be supporting this evening. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, we know that we have some drainage problems in this area of town. And you've heard people, you know, in the audience talk about them. I've heard Councilman Brooks talk about, you know, his very neighborhood being flooded. But this has been a very messy process. Going back to when this body was asked to approve a proclamation in support of the preferred alternative for I-70, way before the supplemental draft was even released. And I caution my colleagues to not vote for a preferred alternative before the actual supplemental draft of the EIS had been released, because we didn't know all the details of what was in that document. It was then later followed up with an IGA that directly tied all the drainage in this area to the I-70 project. So much so that we're responsible for maintaining the lid over the highway, which is supposed to be the mitigation for the project. So I challenge why we, the city of Denver, number one, should have ever agreed to be on the hook for the maintenance of that lid, but then number two, that, you know, it ended up in the IGA. And then you look at the funny math that happened. We ended up swapping land that's underneath I-70 with CDOT that became part of the budget of how we then fund part of the drainage. They put their $40 million in, and if it exceeded a certain threshold, which it already has, then they're on the hook for more money. But the public process on the 39th Avenue Channel happened way after all of that approval processes had come before this body of city council. So when the neighborhood started coming to public meetings and learning about this 39th Avenue Channel, and I remember being told, we're either going to do City Park Golf Course or we're going to do 39th Avenue Channel, But at no point was there a discussion that we would do both. But here we are. We're doing both. And we're doing the Park Hill Golf Course. So all of this, and that's why I wanted to see the big picture budget of what was brought to us as one project, the Twin Basin Drainage Project. Again, now called the Platte to Park Hill Project. And I guess one of my concerns is we're going to have City Park Golf Course, Overland Golf Course, and now Park Hill Golf Course all down at the same time. Yes, we don't own Park Hill, but for people who golf and like to keep their revenue in our city and not go play in neighboring jurisdictions, we're going to lose that revenue. Yes, we'll be compensated by the music festival for the lack of use, the lack of play, at Overland, but we're going to have these 3 golf courses down at the same time. And, that's on top of all the rest of the other construction that's going to be happening because of the GO bond that passed. We're going to have lots of projects underway at the same time all over the city. But I guess just to get back to this particular bill here tonight, I want to first say that for those people who have raised concerns about the environmental impact, we just learned today that the materials management plan has been received by the city. They've got to review it. It'll probably be about 3 weeks before that document is public for everybody to see what the material management plan will be as they identify various materials or products that are in the soils that require action levels, based on what they have identified. And in the information that I received today, I was told that there were about 70 borings that took place on the 39th Avenue channel. Somebody mentioned there were only 3.
Councilwoman, that's on the next bill?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We're still on Park Hill.
I'm convoluting it all because in my mind, I see it all as one project because that's how it was brought forward to us. Okay? So I'm sorry, and I'll make my comments now and not make them on the next bill. But I'm just a little frustrated at how, unless we're asking the right questions and demanding information that helps us understand the big picture of what we're dealing with, we see these things piecemeal. And it's hard enough for us to be able to keep it together. I can imagine how challenging and difficult it is for the community who's seeing it piecemeal as well. And this is not to say anything disparaging against our folks in the city who have worked really hard to bring these projects forward, knowing full well we do have some challenges and issues that we're trying to address in this city. I'm just frustrated at our process in how we have rolled this out to the community, and we've got a need that we're trying to address, but at the same time, it's not the what we're doing, it's the how we've done it that hasn't felt so transparent and upfront in the information sharing that is not only being shared with the public, but oftentimes with us. And so I'm not sure how I'm going to vote tonight, but I'm just sharing some of my concerns and frustrations with kind of where we've been with this. And some have had more history than others with this project from the very beginning, but I'm probably leaning more towards not supporting it, and in large part because, we were told we only needed 20 acres initially. Now it's 25, but we're now up to 90 acres in Park Hill Golf Course. And I'm not convinced that that is not in itself going to throw this budget completely on its head. So again, we went from $40 million with CDOT spending money to do drainage to the IGA that was later in excess of 150. Then we were at $300 million when we did the wastewater rate increase. And I'm hoping that if we can do this without having to do 90 acres, we stay within that budget. But if we end up needing up to 90 acres, I'm concerned that there's going to be another ask to put more money into covering all of these costs for these 4 projects that make up this Platte to Park Hill drainage project. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. See no other comments. Madam Secretary, roll call.
Herndon.
Aye.
Cashman. Kniech. Aye. New.
Aye.
Ortega.
No.
Sussman.
Aye.
Black.
Aye.
Clark.
Aye.
Espinoza. Flynn.
No.
Mr. President.
Aye. Please close the voting and announce the results.
I think we're missing somebody. 7-3.
Ortega.
Okay. 7 ayes, 4 nays.
7 ayes, 4 nays, 1396 has passed.